Hello everyone. Tonight, we'll gently wander through the narrow dirt paths of medieval Europe and settle into the quiet, difficult, and deeply ordinary life of a peasant. Close your eyes, if you'd like, and imagine waking up not in a soft bed, but on a pile of straw covered by a scratchy wool blanket. There's no mattress, no pillows, and no warmth unless someone in your family remembered to keep the hearth burning overnight. The air is cool and damp. It smells faintly of smoke, of old wood, of earth, and of the people you live with, because your whole family, maybe even a pig or two, sleeps in the same single room. Life for a peasant in the Middle Ages, which roughly spanned from the 5th to the 15th century, was not one of luxury, freedom, or comfort. You were likely born into your social class, and if your parents were peasants, you almost certainly would be too. Social mobility, the idea of climbing the ranks of society, was nearly impossible for most people. The world was organized around a strict hierarchy, and at the very bottom of that structure were the peasants, the laborers, and the landless poor. The day would begin early, often before sunrise, because daylight was precious and work was endless. If you were a man, your tasks centered around the fields, plowing, sowing, harvesting, or maintaining tools. If you were a woman, your work was just as hard and constant. Preparing meals, spinning wool, tending gardens, raising children, caring for animals, and perhaps even working the fields beside your husband. There were no weekends and no vacations. The rhythm of your life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer required weeding and haymaking. Autumn was the time to harvest. Winter was lean and difficult, and sometimes deadly. You didn't own the land you worked. Most likely, it belonged to a local noble, a lord, or even the church. You might live in a village on a manor, a kind of estate that included farmland, forests, and perhaps a mill or a blacksmith. The lord of the manor collected rents and taxes from you, not in coins, but in grain, eggs, chickens, or labor. You owed him not only a portion of your harvest, but also days of unpaid service, building roads, repairing fences, or helping with the lord's own land. And the taxes didn't stop there. The church also collected what was called a tithe, 1/10 of your produce, even if your own family barely had enough to eat. Religion was deeply embedded in daily life. You prayed when you woke, before every meal, and before you slept. But while faith offered comfort, it also created obligation and fear of sin, of hell, of damnation, and of doing something wrong in a world where very little was in your control. Most peasants couldn't read or write. Education was rare and mostly reserved for the clergy or the children of nobility. Oral tradition was the main way knowledge passed from one generation to the next. You learned from your parents, who had learned from theirs. You knew how to thatch a roof, how to preserve food without salt, how to plant barley, and when to slaughter a pig. You didn't know what was happening in the cities far away, and you might not even know the name of your king. The houses were simple, usually one room, made of wattle and daub, a framework of sticks coated in a sticky mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The roof was thatched with reeds or straw, and it leaked when it rained. There was often no chimney, so smoke from the hearth drifted around the room, irritating your eyes and lungs. But you were used to it. You slept on straw. You ate from wooden bowls. You used your hands more than utensils. Meals were repetitive, mostly bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables were in season. Meat was rare. You might occasionally have eggs or cheese, but hunger was a constant companion. In the worst years, bad harvests could bring famine. One failed season could mean your family starves. And yet, despite all of this, the cold, the hunger, the labor, the taxes, there was also community. Villages were tight-knit. Everyone knew each other. You helped your neighbors because they helped you. You shared tools. You shared news. You celebrated births and mourned deaths together. There were village festivals tied to the church calendar. Feast days when work paused and people danced and drank and laughed, if only for a moment. Peasant life was not romantic. It was harsh and monotonous, but it was also remarkably stable. For centuries, most people in Europe lived this way, generation after generation, planting the same fields, drawing water from the same well, watching the same seasons pass through the same familiar woods. And though kings and empires rose and fell, for the average peasant, little changed. You lived close to the earth and close to death, but also close to family and to the slow, steady heartbeat of rural life. In the next part of our journey, we'll walk into a peasant village, see what it looked like, how it sounded, and what happened there in the course of a single day. As you walk slowly into a medieval peasant village, the first thing you might notice is how small and close everything feels. There are no wide stone streets or grand buildings here, just dirt paths, uneven and rutted, winding between clusters of low wooden huts. The village might have 20 or 30 families, perhaps fewer. It's quiet, except for the bleating of goats, the clucking of chickens, and the soft sound of footsteps on damp soil. Most villages were built near a stream or river, not for beauty but necessity. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, and sometimes turning the wooden wheel of a small mill. The center of the village would often be open ground, a green or common space, not for leisure, but for shared use. This is where animals might graze, where children played in the mud, and where neighbors gathered to talk. The homes surrounding this space were similar in shape and structure. Each one had a low door, a small window or two with shutters but no glass, and a steep thatched roof meant to keep out the rain. These roofs were thick and insulating, made from bundles of straw tied tightly together and layered carefully to let water run down. But they were also homes for birds, insects, and sometimes rats. Inside the homes, it was dark even during the day. There were no lamps, no electricity, and windows were small to keep the warmth in. A single fire pit or hearth provided both light and heat. Smoke drifted upward and seeped out through the thatch or a small hole in the roof. Soot coated the rafters. The air inside smelled of ash, damp wool, and cooked grain. The floor was dirt, sometimes covered with rushes or straw to absorb spills and waste, which were occasionally swept out and replaced. Furniture was basic. A rough table, a few stools, maybe a bench or two. Sleeping spaces were simple, piles of straw or old cloth tucked into corners. Wealthier peasants might have a bed frame or a wooden chest to store clothing or tools, but most had little more than they could carry. In the morning, the village began to stir before the sun rose. A rooster would crow, then a dog barked. Soon, one by one, doors creaked open and people stepped out into the morning chill, rubbing their eyes, pulling cloaks tight around their shoulders. Men with hoes and sickles on their backs, women with baskets and water jugs in their arms, children still sleepy, some barefoot, some already helping. The fields outside the village were long and open, organized into strips. Most land was divided into narrow rows, each assigned to a family. These strips were not fenced. They formed part of the open field system, common across Europe. It meant you didn't farm one neat square of land, but rather several thin slices scattered across the larger area. This was designed to spread out both the fertile and less fertile parts equally. You might have 3 strips in different places, and none of them next to each other. Peasants plowed these strips using heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen. The work was grueling. The earth was not always soft. In some areas, it was clay and clung to the plow, making each step heavy and slow. In others, it was rocky and damaged the blades. If you didn't own oxen, and many didn't, you had to borrow them, usually by joining forces with neighbors and sharing the burden. Crops varied by region, but the staples were common: wheat, barley, rye, oats. Vegetables were grown in small gardens behind the houses: onions, leeks, cabbages, beans. In the fields, rotation was critical. One field might be planted with wheat this year, oats the next, and left fallow in the third. This helped preserve the soil's nutrients, though harvests were still modest. A good year might yield 4 or 5 grains for every one planted. Poor year might yield 2, and in the worst years, nothing at all. Peasants had little control over the weather. A storm could drown the seedlings. A frost could kill young crops. A hot, dry summer could wither the grain before it ripened. And even when the harvest came, much of it was already spoken for. The Lord took his share. The church demanded its tithe. You stored what you could for winter. The rest you ate as best you could, usually in the form of dark, heavy bread, the peasant's staple food. Food was functional, not fancy. Breakfast might be nothing more than a piece of bread and a mug of weak ale. Not because people were drunk, but because water was often unsafe to drink. The ale was low in alcohol and boiled during brewing, making it safer. Midday meals were larger if possible. A thick vegetable pottage made from beans, onions, and whatever greens could be gathered. Dinner was light again, unless it was a feast day. Meat was rare. Chickens laid eggs. They weren't often eaten. Pigs were more common, especially in wooded areas where they could forage. But to eat meat, you had to slaughter, and that meant losing a resource. So, most peasants ate meat only a few times a year, during religious feasts, weddings, or major community events. Preservation was difficult. Without salt, drying, or smoking, meat spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour unless made into cheese. Fish could be caught in rivers, but many were considered the Lord's property. If you were caught poaching game from the forests, a rabbit, a deer, even birds, the punishment could be severe. Some lords ordered hands cut off for repeated offenses. Others imposed heavy fines. The days were long, and the work never ended. But there was still life between the labor. Children laughed and played in the mud. Old stories were told beside the fire. Women gathered to spin wool or prepare herbs. Men repaired tools, carved handles, or mended fences. And sometimes someone would sing, a slow, simple tune passed down from grandparents who had sung it when they were young too. In the evening, the light faded quickly. Candles were a luxury few could afford. You might burn a rushlight, a thin stick of plant soaked in fat, to stretch the hours a little longer. But most people simply went to sleep when it was dark. The body, after so many hours in the fields, was ready to rest. As you laid down on the straw, listening to the fire crackle low and the wind outside whistle through the thatch, you knew tomorrow would be exactly the same. But for now, there was quiet. Not every day in the village was spent working in the fields. While agricultural labor defined the rhythm of peasant life, there were other tasks, quieter, no less important, that filled the spaces between planting and harvesting. These tasks often fell to women, children, the elderly, and anyone not directly engaged in tilling the soil. Inside the home, the hearth was the center of life. It provided heat, cooked food, and gave light. But it also required constant attention. The fire had to be maintained, rekindled with dry twigs each morning, fed with scraps of wood gathered from hedgerows, and banked carefully each night so a few embers would survive until dawn. If the fire went out, it meant borrowing a flame from a neighbor or struggling with flint and tinder, which was slow and frustrating. Cooking was done in iron pots suspended over the fire or placed directly into the coals. There were no ovens in most peasant homes. Bread had to be baked in the village's communal oven, usually owned by the lord or the church, and peasants were often charged a fee to use it. Some tried to bake secretly at home, but this was risky. If caught, it could result in fines or punishment. Even in this small act of survival, you were reminded that nothing truly belonged to you. Outside, women worked constantly, spinning wool into thread, weaving rough cloth, making and mending clothing by hand. Fabric was precious. Most garments were patched and repatched until they could no longer hold a stitch. Wool was the most common material, sheared from the village's few sheep and dyed with local plants. Linen, made from flax, was harder to produce but used for undergarments and shirts when available. Shoes were a luxury. Many peasants went barefoot in the warmer months and wore crude leather shoes or wooden clogs when the weather turned. Clothes were passed down through families, altered to fit new bodies, repaired endlessly. Appearance was secondary to practicality. You wore what kept you warm and covered. Style had no place in a world of labor. Children began helping as soon as they could walk. Boys might scare birds from the crops or help their fathers weed the fields. Girls were often at their mother's side, learning to carry water, prepare food, and tend the garden. There was little concept of childhood as we know it today. A child was simply a small worker in training, valuable for the labor they could offer. Equals. Education was rare. In some places, the local priest might teach boys to read a little Latin, mostly so they could serve during Massachusetts. But this was the exception. Most children never held a book or saw the inside of a school. Knowledge was passed down orally. Names of herbs, ways to care for animals, how to spot the signs of coming frost, or when to plant beans instead of barley. Despite the hardship, There were days of pause, feast days, saints' days, and religious festivals. The church calendar was full of such occasions, and while not all were celebrated with equal enthusiasm, they offered a rare break from labor. On these days, villagers gathered for communal meals, dancing, singing, and games. Ale flowed more freely. Bread was shared. Stories were told. For a few hours, the burdens of daily life were set aside. The church loomed large over every part of a peasant's existence. Even the smallest village had a church or chapel, built from stone if possible, with a bell to call the faithful to prayer. The priest, though often poor himself, held great influence. He was the one who baptized children, blessed marriages, heard confessions, and delivered last rites. He taught fear of hell and hope of salvation. Through him, peasants were reminded constantly of the sins they must avoid and the obedience they must show. The church taught that suffering was part of God's plan, that poverty was not a punishment but a path to virtue. This belief helped many endure the hardship of their lives. Heaven was promised to those who endured their lot with humility. Questioning this order was dangerous both spiritually and socially. Those who spoke against it could be labeled heretics and face serious consequences, including imprisonment or death. Punishment in village life was often public. Small offenses, stealing a loaf of bread, refusing to pay rent, insulting a neighbor, might be dealt with by the village court. Larger crimes could be judged by the lord's officials. Stocks, pillories, public shaming, these were common. Justice was swift and visible, and while it was often harsh, it was also deeply personal. In a small village, everyone knew everyone else's business. Reputation mattered. A single act could affect your standing for years. Marriage was not usually about romance. It was a practical arrangement, often decided by families. Dowries were small or non-existent. Couples married young. Girls as early as 14, boys a few years older, and began raising families in the same huts they grew up in. A wife's role was to bear children, manage the home, and support her husband's labor. A husband's duty was to provide and protect. Love might grow with time, but it was not the foundation. Childbirth was dangerous. There were no doctors, no sterile tools, and very little understanding of infection. Midwives and older women helped deliver babies, using techniques passed down through generations. Still, many women died in childbirth, and many infants did not survive their first year. A family might have 8 or 9 children, but only 3 or 4 might live to adulthood. Death was a constant shadow. Disease could sweep through a village in weeks. Fevers, dysentery, infected wounds, or worse. There were no cures, only prayers. Burials were simple: a wooden cross, a plot near the churchyard, and a short service from the priest. The village moved on because it had to, and yet in all this, the toil, the hunger, the fear, life went on. Fields were still plowed. Bread was still baked. Songs were still sung at dusk. People adapted. They survived not because life was easy, but because they had no choice. In the next part, we'll follow the course of a single year in the life of a medieval peasant, from the frost of winter to the sweat of summer, and see how each season brought its own rhythm, danger, and hope. To understand peasant life in its full rhythm, it helps to walk through the year, not by the calendar we use today, but by the seasons that truly governed everything. For a medieval peasant, time was not measured by dates or clocks. It was measured by the smell of turned earth, the budding of trees, the return of swallows, the angle of the sun, and the condition of the soil underfoot. The year began, in many ways, with the end of winter, a season that tested everyone. In January and February, food stores were at their lowest. Grain supplies ran thin. If you were lucky, your family had salted beans, onions, dried peas, and perhaps a bit of smoked meat or hard cheese left over from the autumn. If not, you might survive on boiled weeds, sour ale, and whatever the cellar still offered. Hunger was common. Starvation in hard years was real. Fires had to be kept going day and night. Wood was scarce. You might burn dry dung or peat. The thatch above you dripped with condensation. Mice nested in the straw. Children coughed from the smoke that hung in the air. Illness visited often in the cold months. Fevers with no names, aching limbs, chills that turned deadly. But as March crept forward, the light began to return. Ice melted from the village well. Snow gave way to muddy paths. The first true work of the year began with plowing. Oxen were brought out again, their hooves unsteady after long winter months in the byre. Plows were repaired, oiled, and tested. Men walked behind them slowly, turning the wet soil into long, dark furrows. Women followed, tossing seeds: barley, oats, rye. Wheat was usually planted in the fall and overwintered, but spring still held much to sow. It was backbreaking work. The soil clung to every tool, every footstep. Cold winds bit at your neck. Rain made everything heavier. But there was also hope in this season, the feeling that the earth might give again. By late April, fields were green with sprouting grain. Villagers tended gardens, clearing weeds, planting beans, garlic, cabbages, onions. Sheep were sheared, and wool was set aside for spinning. Hens began to lay more reliably. You might finally have fresh eggs. Children helped in the gardens, chasing off crows or carrying baskets of compost. May brought longer days. The sun warmed the thatch roofs. Herbs began to grow: sage, mint, nettle, yarrow. Women gathered them carefully, drying leaves, hanging bundles from rafters. They used these plants for healing, cooking, and sometimes for dyes. Each family had its own small patch of known cures: bitter teas for fever, poultices for wounds, infusions for sore throats. There were no doctors here, only tradition. In June and July, haymaking took over. Grass had to be cut by hand. Long, hot hours swinging scythes in unison. The hay was left to dry in the fields, turned with wooden forks, gathered into bundles, and stacked into great mounds for winter. Hay meant survival for livestock. Without it, the oxen and goats would not live through the next cold season. Everyone helped: children, elders, women. It was communal work, and sometimes even joyful. These were also the months of long daylight. Work began early and ended late. Meals were taken outside. You might wash your face in a cold stream and feel briefly clean. There were still no days off, but the labor of summer felt different than the bleak effort of winter. The world was alive. Then came August, and with it the harvest. This was the most important time of the year. Everything depended on it. A poor harvest meant a long, hard winter ahead. A failed harvest meant death. Men sharpened sickles and gathered in the fields as the grain ripened. Wheat, barley, and rye were cut by hand, bound into sheaves, and left to dry in the sun. The whole village worked side by side, sweating, scratching, bending, and lifting. Once dry, the grain was threshed, beaten with flails to knock the seeds loose. Then it was winnowed, tossed in baskets so the wind could blow away the chaff. Grain was stored in sacks, in wooden bins, or clay jars if you had them. Some was set aside for next year's seed. Some was taken by the Lord. Some went to the church. The rest had to last until the next harvest, through frost, illness, hunger, and time. After the grain, there were root vegetables to dig, beans to gather, fruits to pick. Autumn was busy in its own way. Apples were dried. Cabbages were buried or packed into brine. Meat, if you had any, was preserved. It was the last chance to prepare. By October, the days shortened again. The wind turned colder. Fields were bare. Leaves fell and mixed with the muck of the road. Peasants repaired roofs, patched walls, sealed gaps with clay. Livestock were brought closer to home. Firewood was gathered. Tools were oiled and stored. The year was folding back into itself. Then came November and December, the months of waiting. The land slept. You stayed close to home, working indoors when possible. Women spun thread, repaired clothing, made candles from tallow. Men carved handles, made baskets, repaired harnesses. Children were taught whatever skills they could absorb. And finally, in the depths of winter, came the one bright note in the year: Christmas. It was more than a holiday. It was a spiritual and emotional anchor, a reminder that light would return. Though celebrations were modest, they mattered deeply. The church held special masses. The villagers shared food, whatever they could spare. Perhaps a goose was roasted, ale was poured, songs were sung by the fire. For a night, there was warmth. But the day after Christmas was like any other. The cold pressed in, hunger loomed, and the wheel of the year turned again. This was the cycle of a peasant's life, year after year, without great change, without rest. A rhythm shaped not by clocks, but by sun and soil, frost and rain. In the next part, we'll look more closely at the rules that govern this world, the obligations peasants owed, the laws they lived under, and how justice was enforced in the villages of medieval Europe. To live as a peasant in medieval Europe was to live under a web of obligations. Your days were not only shaped by the seasons and the land, but also by the rules of a tightly structured world. These rules were rarely written down for peasants to read. Most couldn't read anyway, but they were enforced, remembered, and passed along with quiet certainty. At the heart of this structure was the manorial system, sometimes called feudalism, though the two are not exactly the same. The manor was both a physical place and an economic unit. A village, its surrounding fields, pastures, and woodlands, all under the control of a lord, who could be a noble, a knight, a bishop, or even a monastery. You, as a peasant, lived on his land, worked it, and owed him certain dues in exchange for the right to remain there. There were different kinds of peasants. Some were free peasants with certain legal rights and the ability to move or own small plots of land. Others, the majority in many regions, were serfs. Serfs were not slaves, but they were not fully free either. You couldn't leave the manor without permission. You couldn't marry outside the village without the lord's approval. If the land was sold, you stayed with it. You were bound, not by chains but by custom and law. Your obligations took many forms. The most basic was labor service, known as corvée. Several days each week you worked the lord's domain, the portion of land reserved for his own profit. You plowed it, sowed it, harvested it. You might also mend his fences, dig ditches, haul stones, or gather firewood. This was unpaid labor, required by law or custom. Refusal could bring punishment, fines, seizure of goods, or worse. In addition to labor, you owed rents, often paid in kind, not coin. A portion of your grain, a few eggs, a jug of ale, a chicken at Michaelmas. These dues were due at set times each year, tied to religious festivals or agricultural cycles. You also had to pay fees to use the lord's mill, winepress, or oven, even if you preferred to do the work yourself. Grinding grain at home was often forbidden. These fees weren't high individually, but they added up over time. And then there were the banalities, rights held by the lord over daily village life. He could demand your service in times of need. He could enforce local law through the manorial court, which judged disputes over property, theft, insults, broken agreements, or damage to crops. The court met in the lord's hall or under a tree, and decisions were made by the reeve, a peasant official, and jury of local men. Punishments varied, from fines and public shaming to confiscation of goods. The laws were not always written. Much of what governed peasant life was unwritten custom, traditions passed down from generation to generation. You knew what you owed because your father did, and his father before him. These customs were powerful. Even the lord, in many cases, couldn't change them easily. Breaking with tradition could cause unrest. Still, the system was far from fair. Lords held the power. They could raise fees, take more land, or punish harshly. Some were lenient and kind. Others were cruel and arbitrary. The church offered spiritual guidance, but it too demanded dues, a tithe, usually 1/10 of your produce, which went to support the local parish or a distant monastery. This tithe was expected regardless of whether you could afford it. In some villages, the church court operated alongside the manorial court. It handled cases involving moral behavior, adultery, swearing, failure to attend mass, disputes over marriage. These courts relied on confession and reputation. Gossip could become evidence. A neighbor's word might shape your fate. Despite these burdens, many peasants accepted the structure of their world. It gave stability. It was, in its own way, predictable. The lord provided protection from bandits or raiders. In times of famine, he might open his grain stores. During external wars or feuds, his knights defended the manor. In return, the peasant gave labor, loyalty, and a life of obedience. There were few alternatives. The cities, where freedom might be found, were distant and dangerous. Travel was rare. You likely never ventured more than a few miles from your home. The forests were filled with thieves and wolves. The roads were poor and often lawless. And even if you reached a town, you would be an outsider, without guild membership, without a trade, without protection. Occasionally, unrest stirred. A lord might raise taxes too high. A harvest might fail. Disease could sweep through the manor, taking the strong and the weak alike. And sometimes, the accumulated frustrations of many years could spark rebellion. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 showed how deep that resentment could run. Men who had known only obedience took up arms. They demanded fairer treatment, lower taxes, and a say in their own lives. But such revolts were rare and rarely successful. Most were crushed. The leaders were executed. Life returned to the old ways. The system endured because it was deeply rooted in law, in faith, in custom, in fear. Still, there were quiet resistances. Peasants might delay paying dues, conceal part of their harvest, help each other in secret, or grumble behind closed doors. They taught their children to endure, to remember, to know who they were. And through all of it, the rhythm of village life went on, the sowing, the reaping, the gathering, the praying. The laws pressed down, but people adapted. They found ways to live beneath the weight of obligation. In the next part, we'll step away from the fields and look more closely at family life inside the peasant home. How families were structured, what childhood looked like, how marriages worked, and what daily life meant behind closed doors. While peasant families worked the land from sunrise to sundown, their connection to the seasons was absolute. The very rhythm of their lives pulsed with the calendar of the earth. Spring brought the plowing of fields and the sowing of seeds, often barley, oats, and rye. These grains were staples for most villagers, forming the basis of their diet through the year. But spring was also a time of uncertainty, especially if the winter stores had run low or mold had spoiled what little was left. Hunger gnawed at bellies as fields waited to yield their bounty. Summer, though bright and full of life, brought its own pressures. It was the time to weed the fields, mend fences, shear sheep, and prepare for the all-important harvest. A poor harvest could mean the difference between survival and starvation during the long, cold months ahead. In some years, just one unseasonal storm or prolonged drought could destroy the crops, and with them, the hopes of an entire community. Autumn was a time of urgent labor. The harvest had to be gathered before the frosts arrived. Men, women, and even children participated, scything down the tall stalks and tying them into sheaves. Grain had to be dried, threshed, winnowed, and stored, usually in communal barns or the Lord's granary. If the peasants were lucky, they kept a portion for themselves, while the rest was taken as rent or tithe. Potatoes had not yet arrived in Europe, so root vegetables like turnips, leeks, and onions became staples during the winter. But winter was a season of hardship. The fields lay fallow and silent, the ground frozen and hard. Days were short, nights were long and cold. Peasants would huddle close to the hearth, the only source of warmth and light, burning peat or dried animal dung if wood was scarce. Meals became sparse. Bread, porridge, and watery vegetable stew repeated day after day. If a family had salted pork or dried fish, it was rationed carefully. Malnutrition and illness often spread quickly in the damp, smoky confines of the cottage. Yet despite these hardships, peasants found ways to survive. Community mattered deeply. Families supported one another. Tools were shared, and when someone fell ill, neighbors often stepped in to help with the animals or the fields. Religion, too, was central. The church offered not only spiritual hope but a communal rhythm, feast days, saints' days, and holy celebrations that punctuated the bleakness of daily labor. Though tithes were burdensome, and the church held immense power, it also structured time and provided rare moments of festivity. Festivals, even small local ones, gave peasants something to look forward to. On certain feast days, people would gather in the village square, sometimes enjoying music, dancing, or puppet shows. A pig might be roasted, ale would flow, and for one evening, the crushing weight of survival would lift slightly. These moments were treasured and remembered during the long days of toil that followed. Marriage was another central part of peasant life. Unlike the nobility, where alliances and wealth dictated unions, peasant marriages were more often about companionship and practicality. Young people typically married in their late teens or early 20s, often within their own village or one nearby. Dowries were modest: a few chickens, a goat, a patch of land, but the joining of two families could strengthen both. Once married, a woman joined her husband's household and quickly assumed the same workload, both in the fields and the home. Children soon followed. Childbirth, however, was dangerous. Without trained midwives or medical knowledge, many women died in labor. Infants, too, were at risk. High infant mortality meant that large families were common, not out of abundance, but out of necessity. Every child who survived past infancy was another hand for the harvest and another chance at carrying the family line. Children were not shielded from the harshness of peasant life. From a young age, they helped in the fields, gathered firewood, fetched water, or tended livestock. Education was rare, especially in the earlier medieval centuries. If a child learned anything at all, it was usually religious, basic prayers or hymns taught by the local priest. Reading and writing were privileges of the elite. And yet, despite the weight of labor and poverty, joy still existed in small doses. Children made up games with sticks and stones, told stories by the fire, or learned to sing folk songs passed down through generations. These oral traditions carried history and identity, preserving culture in the absence of written records. Evenings were slow and quiet. Without clocks or artificial light, the sun dictated the schedule. Once darkness fell, families retreated indoors. The single-room cottage might hold several people: parents, children, grandparents, all sleeping on straw mats or wooden boards, huddled under rough wool blankets. Privacy didn't exist. The closeness bred both comfort and tension, but it was simply the way of life. As the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the hearth, and wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls, peasants drifted into sleep. Tomorrow would come early. The sun would rise again, and with it, the endless tasks of survival. But for now, under the thatched roof of a mud and timber home, the medieval peasant rested, wrapped in a brief moment of peace before the grind of the next day. Food was at the very center of a medieval peasant's life, not just as sustenance, but as a daily struggle. For most peasants in medieval Europe, especially during the early and high Middle Ages, getting enough to eat was never guaranteed. Their diets were simple, monotonous, and often left them on the brink of hunger, particularly in poor harvest years or during the cold winter months. And yet, the rhythm of meals was a central part of peasant life, offering moments of pause in an otherwise grueling day. The staple of the peasant diet was bread, but not the soft, fluffy loaves we're familiar with today. This was coarse, dark, and often hard bread made from rye, barley, or oats, grains that were more resilient and easier to grow in the rocky, wet, or overused soils of the peasant plots. White bread, made from finely ground wheat flour, was a luxury reserved for nobles and the clergy. The common peasant would likely never taste it in their lifetime. Their bread was sometimes mixed with ground beans or peas to stretch the flour supply, especially during lean times. Flour itself was a difficult commodity to come by. Milling was controlled by the lord of the manor, and peasants were required to use his mill and pay a fee, often in the form of a portion of their already scarce grain. Some tried to grind their own flour at home to avoid the tax, but this was illegal in many regions and could result in punishment or fines. The lords knew the value of control over food, and the mill was a powerful tool of economic dominance. Soups and porridges were the other main components of the diet. These were made from whatever vegetables were in season or could be stored. Cabbage, onions, garlic, leeks, and beans were the most common. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants. Pigs were sometimes kept by the poorest, as they could scavenge and didn't require pasture, but they were often slaughtered only once or twice a year. The meat would be salted or smoked to make it last. Hunting was largely forbidden to peasants. Game belonged to the lord, and poaching could bring severe penalties, even death. Instead of meat, peasants might supplement their meals with dairy, milk, cheese, and butter if they owned a cow or a few goats. Eggs were another modest source of protein, but most chickens were valued more for their eggs than for their meat. Fish was consumed in some regions, especially near rivers or the sea, and was especially important during religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. However, even fish could be out of reach for many inland peasants who lacked the tools or rights to fish freely. Drinks were another matter entirely. Water from streams or wells could be contaminated, and so most people drank ale, low in alcohol and safer than untreated water. Brewing was a common domestic task, usually performed by women. Ale was consumed at every meal, even by children, and households brewed it regularly. Wealthier peasants might add herbs to flavor it, but most made do with what they had. Seasonality was everything. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available in certain months, and preserving them for winter was labor-intensive and not always successful. Dried peas, beans, and root vegetables stored in cellars helped bridge the gap, but hunger was common in the late winter and early spring, when supplies ran low and the next harvest was still months away. This time was often referred to as the hunger gap. Peasants relied on communal ovens in some villages, bringing their dough to be baked alongside others. In smaller hamlets, they might build a small clay oven of their own, though the fuel required to heat it, wood or peat, was yet another resource not always easy to access. Gathering firewood from the forest was often restricted or taxed by the lord, and peasants had to be careful not to run afoul of forest laws. Despite all this, meal times were moments of small relief. Families would gather together around the hearth, sharing from a common bowl. Meals were eaten with fingers or with a simple wooden spoon. Knives were rare and considered personal property, not something shared among the family. Plates, if they existed at all, were simple wooden or earthenware discs, or just bread trenchers that absorbed juices and were eventually eaten or thrown away. There was little ceremony in peasant meals, but there was a kind of rhythm and order. A prayer might be spoken if the family was devout. The father or eldest male usually received the first and largest portion, followed by the children and women. Hunger taught its own manners, and nothing was wasted. Food scarcity influenced every aspect of peasant life. How they worked, how they raised children, how they related to the seasons and their lords. A poor harvest didn't just mean smaller portions. It could mean malnutrition, disease, and death. In some years, whole villages would suffer through famine, with the weakest succumbing first. Grain riots were not uncommon, and rumors of better harvests elsewhere would sometimes inspire desperate journeys that ended in disappointment or worse. But in good years, a peasant family might just have enough grain stored, a few vegetables from the garden, some fresh eggs, and perhaps even a bit of meat on feast days. Those rare moments of abundance were remembered for years. Even in the hardest times, the hope of a full stomach tomorrow helped carry them through the day. And yet, food was just one part of a complex life bound by labor, fear, tradition, and the cycle of the seasons. As the evening bell rang and the fires died down, a peasant would lie on a straw mattress, if they were lucky, with a belly half full and the sound of the wind outside. Sleep was a brief reprieve. The next day would begin early, and the fight to survive would start all over again. The peasant's day, though seemingly monotonous, was governed by the rhythms of the earth and the expectations of the feudal system. At the heart of this delicate balance stood the lord of the manor, an ever-present figure whose reach extended into every corner of peasant life. While the peasants toiled endlessly in the fields, they owed not only a share of their crops, but also their loyalty, labor, and often arbitrary dues. It was not enough to survive. They had to survive while appeasing the whims of the one who controlled the land on which they depended. Peasants were typically categorized into two types: freemen and serfs. A freeman, in theory, had more mobility and could rent land from a lord in exchange for rent paid in money or produce. Serfs, however, were tied to the land, bound by feudal obligations, and could not leave without the lord's permission. While some freemen managed a modest independence, the vast majority of peasants were serfs, and their position was hereditary. If you were born to a serf family, you too would live and die under that same status. In a world where the social hierarchy was etched into stone, upward mobility was almost non-existent. Duties varied depending on the season, but throughout the year, peasants were expected to provide corvée labor, working several days each week on the lord's domain, or personal land, for no pay. This was in addition to working their own small strips of land to feed their families. The fields of a village weren't large unified plots, but narrow strips scattered across different areas. This system, called open field farming, ensured that land was distributed evenly, though it made farming inefficient and time-consuming. You might spend hours walking between the plots you were assigned to. Then there were the taxes. There was a tax on nearly everything. A tithe to the church, 10% of your produce, fees to use the Lord's mill to grind grain, to bake in the Lord's oven, or even to marry. Yes, even marriage required permission and a fee, especially if a serf wanted to marry someone from another manor, which required paying a fine to the Lord for the loss of labor. And let's not forget the heriot, a death tax where the Lord could claim your best animal when you died. Even in death, the system extracted value from your existence. Despite this, peasants were not powerless. Their lives were hard, but communities were tight-knit, and customs often offered some protections. Lords could be resisted through local tradition, and villages maintained a form of self-governance through the manor court. This court, overseen by the Lord's steward, handled disputes and ensured that customs were followed. Peasants served as jurors and presented grievances. It wasn't democracy, but it was a system that gave the people a voice, albeit limited. Peasant homes were modest at best. A typical medieval peasant house was a single-room structure made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and sticks, held together by a timber frame. The roof was thatched and the floor was often dirt. There was little furniture beyond a few wooden benches, a table, and perhaps a chest for storage. Beds, if you could call them that, were often straw-filled mattresses on the floor. Families and sometimes animals lived together in this confined space, especially in colder months when livestock were brought inside for warmth. Hygiene was rudimentary. Water came from communal wells or streams, which could easily become contaminated. Bathing was infrequent, not because people thought it was bad, but because it was simply inconvenient and sometimes impossible in winter. Instead, peasants might wipe themselves down with a cloth and use herbal infusions to mask odors. Fleas and lice were a common nuisance, and illnesses spread quickly. Clothing was utilitarian. Men typically wore tunics made of coarse wool, belted at the waist, with woolen leggings and simple leather shoes. Women wore long dresses with aprons and head coverings. Clothes were dyed in subdued earth tones using natural materials. Everything was handmade, and garments were patched repeatedly. New clothes were a luxury, often only acquired on special occasions or passed down through generations. But amid the struggle and hardship, there were moments of joy. Feast days, though dictated by the church calendar, offered brief reprieve from labor. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and harvest festivals brought the community together. There was dancing, music played on simple instruments like fiddles and flutes, and even games. These moments, though fleeting, were cherished. They offered a glimpse of levity in lives defined by duty and survival. The church played a central role in daily life, not just spiritually, but socially and economically. Peasants attended Mass weekly, and churches often served as the only source of literacy in a village. Monks and priests taught basic catechism and Latin prayers, though few peasants were literate. Still, stories from the Bible were told through stained glass, frescoes, and sermons. The church also dictated what people could and couldn't eat and do. Certain foods were forbidden during Lent and on fasting days, which were numerous. For most, the idea of questioning this structure never arose. The church taught that the feudal order was divinely ordained, that everyone had a place in the great chain of being, and peasants were to labor and accept their lot humbly. To rebel against this order was not just dangerous, it was sinful. But even so, in moments of famine or injustice, uprisings did occur. Most were swiftly crushed, yet they remained as echoes of discontent in a system designed to endure. In the evenings, after a day spent toiling in the fields or performing duties for the manor, a peasant family would gather around the hearth. The The fire was essential, not only for warmth and cooking but also as the emotional center of the home. Children would listen to stories told by elders, tales of saints, of brave knights, or clever animals. Oral tradition was how knowledge and entertainment passed from one generation to the next. Outside, the night would descend in silence. No hum of electricity, no distant cars. Just the soft rustle of wind through trees, the occasional bark of a dog, or the hoot of an owl. A stillness so complete, modern life rarely experiences it. And so they lived quiet lives governed by the earth, the seasons, the church, and the Lord. In many ways, it was a world far removed from our own. But within their simple routines and structured burdens, the medieval peasants crafted a rhythm of life that endured for centuries. Let's continue and explore what happened when this delicate system was disrupted. As the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the thatched rooftops, the day's work for the medieval peasant was far from over. Evening chores beckoned, tasks just as crucial as those done under the midday sun. Animals had to be tended to. If a family was fortunate enough to own a pig or a few chickens, these creatures required feeding, cleaning, and protection. A pig was a valuable source of food, fat, and leather, and losing one to disease or theft could be devastating. Chickens provided precious eggs, and in lean times, even a scrawny bird could mean the difference between hunger and a meal. The peasant woman, in most households, took responsibility for maintaining the hearth. She cooked over an open fire, using basic tools and often reused ingredients. Meals were repetitive, thick pottage made from grains and vegetables, seasoned lightly if at all. Herbs were a luxury and spices nearly mythical. Most peasants had never tasted pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg. Salt was essential not just for flavor but for preserving meat and fish. If a peasant family could obtain salt, it was guarded like treasure. Boiling water was another routine task, not only for cooking but also to make the water safe to drink, though many simply drank weak ale instead, which was seen as healthier due to the brewing process killing off harmful microbes. The evening also brought religious obligations. Christianity was not merely a belief system but an all-encompassing framework for life. Every peasant village had a church or a small chapel, and bells tolled not just to mark time, but to signal worship. Sunday was a sacred day of rest, though for many peasants, it still involved light labor like feeding animals. Attendance at Mass was expected, and skipping it could lead to social or spiritual penalties. The priest, often the only literate man in the village, held significant power, not only as a spiritual guide but as the gatekeeper of news, confessions, and in some cases, judgment. Evening prayers were usually brief and humble. Most peasants couldn't read Latin, and their understanding of scripture was limited to what the priest conveyed. Nonetheless, the fear of sin, purgatory, and eternal damnation loomed heavily in their lives. Misfortunes, failed crops, illness, miscarriages, were often attributed to divine punishment or a lapse in faith. Superstition and religion blended easily. It was not uncommon for villagers to believe in curses, omens, or the healing power of relics. Amulets, charms, or pieces of cloth blessed by a priest might be worn or hidden in the home, especially during sickness or childbirth. As darkness enveloped the village, danger grew more present. There were no streetlights, no safety patrols. Peasants relied on oil lamps or simple torches if they dared to venture out. Wolves still roamed the outskirts of some settlements, and wild dogs were a threat to livestock. Worse still, human danger lurked. Outlaws, desperate men, and even feuding neighbors could pose a real threat. With no formal police, justice was often local and swift. Disputes over land, theft, or even insults could lead to bloodshed. The manor court, overseen by the Lord Steward, resolved many minor offenses, but some disagreements were settled with fists or worse. Inside the cottage, most families huddled together for warmth. Heating came from the central hearth, and insulation was practically non-existent. In winter, frost formed on the inside of walls. Children often slept in the same bed as their parents, not out of affection but necessity. Privacy was an unknown concept. Clothes were rarely changed, and linens even less so. Lice, Fleas and other pests were part of everyday life. There was no soap as we know it. Instead, ashes, sand, or rough cloth might be used to scrub skin. Bathing was infrequent and sometimes seen as dangerous, as some believed open pores invited illness. Still, amidst the hardship, there was connection. Storytelling became the evening's entertainment. Around the fire, older villagers passed down tales, some factual, others legends. Stories of saints, monsters, heroic ancestors, or strange lights in the sky. Laughter, despite everything, found its place. A well-told joke or an exaggerated tale could lift spirits. Songs were sung, sometimes mournful, sometimes celebratory. The peasant's life, while grueling, wasn't entirely devoid of joy. It was simply found in the smallest moments. A child's giggle, the rare feast day, a good harvest, or a warm loaf of bread shared among family. But the peace of the evening could be broken in an instant. A messenger from the Lord with new demands, a rider warning of war or plague, or the wails of a woman going into labor with no midwife nearby. Life balanced constantly on the edge of change, and for the medieval peasant, control was an illusion. They lived with the understanding that tomorrow could bring rain or ruin, and all they could do was endure. And yet, endure they did generation after generation, holding fast to the soil and each other. By the time the first rays of sunlight pushed through the fog and smoke of the village, the peasant household was already alive with movement. Bread crusts were broken in silence, and the small fire from the previous evening was coaxed back to life with brittle twigs and careful breath. Morning meals were rarely more than a thin pottage, sometimes flavored with herbs like nettle, parsley, or garlic if the season allowed it. On days of particular scarcity, it might just be a few crusts softened in warm ale. Yes, ale, not water. For peasants, water could not always be trusted, and ale, weak and homemade, was safer to drink. Even children drank it, and no one thought anything unusual about that. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, and as summer turned into autumn, labor intensified. Harvest was the most critical time of year. If the fields failed to yield enough, it meant hunger, illness, or death during the winter. Every able-bodied man, woman, child was required in the fields. Scythes sliced through wheat under the sun's relentless gaze. Hands bound the stalks into sheaves, and oxen carts moved slowly, overloaded with grain. The labor was endless and unforgiving. A peasant's hands were rarely without blisters, and the skin beneath fingernails was often stained with earth that never truly washed out. Harvest was also the time when tithes had to be paid. A tenth of your yield, no matter how poor your crop had been, was due to the church. Then came the Lord's share, often an additional hefty portion, taken as rent or obligation. If you couldn't pay, the consequences varied. Some lords were merciful, allowing for deferred payments or labor in place of grain. Others were not, and punishment might come swiftly: confiscated livestock, public shaming, or being turned off the land entirely. There were no banks, no savings. Everything was seasonal. Surplus meant safety, but it was rare. Droughts, hailstorms, mold, or locusts could destroy a crop overnight, and the family that had toiled for months might be left with nothing. Starvation wasn't theoretical, it was real and familiar. Famine was not a stranger but a recurring visitor in medieval Europe. There were years entire regions would suffer and thousands would perish. And yet peasants kept sowing. Despite the grind of labor and the threat of hunger, small moments of joy still slipped through. A well-timed joke in the fields, the laughter of a child chasing a chicken, the warmth of sharing bread with a neighbor. All reminders that life, however harsh, still offered glimpses of comfort. Bonds between villagers were strong. In many ways, survival depended on it. If a neighbor's roof caved in, others would help repair it. If a child lost both parents to fever, another family might take them in. Solidarity wasn't just kindness. It was necessity. Women worked just as hard as men, often harder. In addition to toiling in the fields, they managed the household. Cooking, spinning wool, weaving cloth, raising children, tending gardens, and sometimes even brewing ale. Some women also took part in the harvest or helped their husbands in the manorial duties. There were no days off and little distinction between roles. A peasant woman might give birth in the morning and be back tending the goats by nightfall. Pain was constant, but complaint was rare. Life was simply like that. Children began work young. By age 6 or 7, many were already helping with chores, guarding geese, collecting firewood, assisting in planting or harvesting. Formal education was almost non-existent for peasants. If a village was lucky enough to have a priest who could read, perhaps he might teach a few boys their letters, especially if they were destined for the church. But for most, learning came through imitation, observation, and repetition. Life itself was the teacher, and the lessons were steeped in necessity. Religion shaped every element of their existence. The church was not just a spiritual guide. It was the social backbone of the village. It set the calendar, marked the seasons, offered the only sanctioned explanations for suffering, and dictated behavior. A bell from the church might signal when to begin or end work, when to pray, or when a feast or fast was due. Every village had its saints and relics, and peasants believed deeply in miracles, curses, and divine punishment. Hell was real and terrifying, and heaven was the ultimate reward for a life of obedience and toil. Sunday was not a rest day in the modern sense. It was a holy day, and peasants were expected to attend Massachusetts. Missing it without cause could bring punishment, both spiritual and earthly. After church, there might be a market or a small feast if the day coincided with a local saint's celebration. For many, it was the only time to socialize, to trade, or to hear news from beyond the village. These were rare pauses in a life otherwise consumed by work. But behind the walls of the manor, where the lords and their families dined on meat and sweetened wine, the peasants remained invisible, anonymous laborers who kept the entire system afloat. They were many, yet voiceless. They were tired, yet enduring. Their lives were short, but full of quiet resilience. Theirs was not a history of grand battles or royal decrees. It was a history of survival, of bending but not breaking. And as the harvest moon rose, lighting the thatched rooftops in silver, they knew that tomorrow they would rise again. Always. Disease was an ever-present shadow in the lives of medieval peasants, lurking silently within their crowded cottages, contaminated wells, and dirt paths. With no understanding of germs or sanitation, illness spread quickly and mercilessly. Simple wounds could fester and become deadly infections, while seasonal fevers swept through villages, leaving a trail of sorrow in their wake. Childhood mortality was heartbreakingly high. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 children never reached adulthood. Parents bore this constant risk silently, often naming many children but losing them young. Survivors were precious, their labor vital for the family's survival. One of the most feared threats was the plague, the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century and wiped out nearly half the population in some regions. Entire villages vanished, fields lay fallow, and the feudal order trembled under the weight of this catastrophe. But even before the plague, disease was common. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, typhus, and respiratory infections were frequent killers. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Most villages had no sewage system. Waste was often dumped into the streets or nearby rivers, contaminating drinking water. People bathed rarely, and personal hygiene was minimal. Clothes were rarely changed or washed, providing fertile ground for lice and fleas. The close quarters of peasant cottages meant that once disease struck, it spread rapidly. Medical care was primitive and largely based on superstition or religious belief. Wise women or local healers might treat illnesses with herbs, poultices, or prayers. Physicians existed but were rare and expensive, often confined to towns or monasteries. Surgery was risky and often fatal. The concept of quarantine was unknown or ignored, which helped diseases spread further. Despite this, peasants showed remarkable resilience. Folk remedies passed down through generations helped ease suffering. Willow bark, for example, was used to reduce pain and fever, centuries before aspirin was invented. Herbal teas, honey, and poultices were applied for wounds and digestive ailments. Some relied heavily on the intercession of saints or relics, visiting shrines in hopes of miraculous cures. Life expectancy was low. Many peasants died before reaching 40. Women faced additional dangers in childbirth, with complications often proving fatal. Fathers and mothers watched their children grow up quickly or disappear altogether. The cyclical nature of life and death shaped their worldview, instilling a sense of fatalism but also a deep appreciation for the fleeting moments of happiness. Communal burial grounds surrounded village churches. Graves were shallow and close together, a reflection of necessity and the sheer number of deaths. Mourning was often private and brief. Survival demanded it. Yet funerals were also important social events, offering a chance for the community to gather, share grief, and renew social bonds. The harsh reality of disease added another layer of hardship to peasant life, but also shaped their relationships with each other, with nature, and with the divine. In the face of suffering, faith, community, and endurance remained their strongest shields. Next, we will explore how moments of celebration and festivity broke through the toil and hardship, giving peasants a glimpse of joy and communal belonging. Despite the endless toil and hardships that defined peasant life in medieval Europe, moments of celebration punctuated the year, moments when the entire village would come alive in color, sound, and shared joy. These occasions were deeply rooted in both religious observance and the rhythms of the agrarian calendar, offering peasants rare opportunities to relax, socialize, and express communal identity. The most important celebrations were tied to the Christian calendar. The Church's influence shaped nearly every festival, and most feasts were occasions for rest from labor, communal worship, and merriment. Christmas and Easter were the two biggest events of the year, marking the birth and resurrection of Christ, respectively. During these times, the usual austerity softened. The fasts of Lent were lifted, and rich foods might be eaten. Although peasants could rarely afford lavish meals, the promise of special bread, salted meat, and perhaps a pint of ale made these days eagerly anticipated. Other feast days honored local saints, often connected to the village's church or monastery. These could involve processions, singing hymns, and sometimes dramatic performances depicting biblical stories or legends. The Feast of St. Michael in late September marked the end of the harvest and was celebrated with great enthusiasm. It was a time to give thanks for survival and bounty and to prepare for the hardships of winter. During these festivals, peasants might wear their best clothes, simple but clean and sometimes embroidered if the family had the means. Dancing was common, accompanied by instruments like fiddles, drums, and simple flutes. Music and dance not only lifted spirits but also reinforced social bonds, fostering a sense of unity that was essential for survival in a demanding world. Some celebrations had their roots in older pre-Christian traditions. The spring festival of May Day, for example, was linked to fertility and the renewal of life. Villagers might decorate the maypole with flowers and ribbons, engaging in dances symbolizing the turning of the seasons and the promise of growth. These customs often blended with Christian beliefs, creating a rich tapestry of folk practices that varied widely by region. Markets and fairs also provided opportunities for socializing and trade. While peasants mostly lived within their manors, larger towns hosted markets on specific days, where villagers could sell surplus goods, purchase necessities, or hear news from distant places. Fairs, which might last several days, combined commerce with entertainment. Jugglers, storytellers, and traveling musicians performed for crowds, bringing glimpses of the wider world to even the most remote villages. However, festivals were not only about pleasure. They reinforced the social hierarchy and religious order. The lord and clergy often presided over celebrations, reminding peasants of their place in the feudal system. The church used these occasions to reinforce moral lessons and encourage obedience. Yet, for peasants, the brief respite from hardship was invaluable. It offered not just physical relief but emotional and spiritual renewal. Marriage celebrations were another important source of festivity. Weddings were community affairs, often lasting several days with feasting, dancing, and gift-giving. Marrying was a milestone that symbolized the continuity of family and village life. Though marriages were often arranged or practical, they were celebrated with genuine joy and hope for the future. Evenings after festivals could be filled with storytelling around the hearth, where tales of heroes, saints, and tricksters entertained young and old alike. These stories were more than amusement. They preserved history, taught lessons, and kept traditions alive in a mostly oral culture. In a life defined by toil, famine, and obligation, these moments of celebration provided much-needed relief. They forged bonds that held communities together, reminding peasants that despite their hardships, they were part of something larger, a shared culture, faith, and history. As the seasons turned once more, and the familiar cycle of planting and harvest resumed, the memory of these joyful days lingered, fueling hope and endurance for the difficult days ahead. The medieval peasant's relationship with land was more than economic. It was deeply personal and shaped by centuries of custom, inheritance, and necessity. Unlike the large, enclosed estates of nobles, peasant landholdings were often fragmented and shared communally, a system known as the open field system. Instead of owning a single, contiguous plot, a peasant's strips of farmland were scattered across different fields, interspersed with those of neighbors. This arrangement, though inefficient by modern standards, reflected a complex balance of tradition, fairness, and the need for mutual support. Villagers held land collectively as part of the manor, with the lord retaining ultimate ownership. The fields were divided into large strips, some for crops, others left fallow to recover nutrients. Every year, these strips were rotated among families, ensuring that no single family was permanently stuck with the poorest land. This rotation was essential for soil health but required cooperation and trust among villagers. Common land was another vital part of the landscape. These were pastures, woodlands, or marshes shared by the entire village. Peasants could graze their animals here, gather firewood, or collect wild herbs and berries. Access to commons was crucial, especially for poorer families who might not have enough arable land to support livestock. However, commons were also carefully regulated by village customs and overseen by the lord's steward. Overuse or abuse could lead to fines or loss of access. Because peasants did not own the land outright, they faced constant insecurity. They paid rent, usually in produce or labor, to the lord, who could raise demands or evict tenants at will. In some regions, peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land and unable to leave without permission. This meant that their entire identity, livelihood, and family fate were intertwined with the fields they worked. Land was passed down through families, but inheritance rules varied widely. In some places, primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting everything, prevailed, while in others, land was divided equally among children. Dividing land among many heirs often led to fragmentation, making it harder for families to survive on smaller plots. This sometimes forced younger siblings to seek work as laborers, join the clergy, or leave for towns. Farming itself was a backbreaking endeavor. Without modern machinery, all work was done by hand or with the help of oxen and horses. Wooden plows, known as ard plows, were pulled by oxen to till the heavy soils, though in some places heavier iron plows were used. Plowing was slow and exhausting, and wet or rocky soil made the task even harder. Planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and winnowing all required manual labor. Crop choices were limited. Cereals like rye, barley, oats, and wheat were staples. Rye and barley could grow in poorer soils, while wheat was more desirable but harder to cultivate. Legumes such as peas and beans were important for nutrition and for enriching the soil with nitrogen. Root vegetables like turnips and onions helped provide food during winter. Crop failure was a constant threat. Poor weather, pests, or disease could devastate a harvest, leading to famine. Peasants had few safety nets. If their fields failed, they faced starvation or debt. The lord's demands remained, regardless of circumstances, adding to their burden. Despite the difficulties, the connection to land was profound. It was the source of life, identity, and community. Rituals surrounded farming. Prayers for good weather, offerings to saints, and celebrations marking planting and harvest. These customs reflected a worldview where humans and nature were intertwined in a fragile, sacred balance. Land also shaped social relations. Working the fields together, sharing tools and labor, and maintaining common boundaries fostered a sense of interdependence. Disputes over land were among the most serious conflicts, sometimes leading to violence or long-standing feuds. In this way, land was not just soil and crops. It was the foundation of peasant existence, a stage for the dramas of survival, cooperation, and resilience that defined medieval rural life. One of the cornerstones of medieval peasant life was the village community itself. Unlike the isolated farmer working alone, most peasants lived clustered in villages, tight-knit groups where cooperation was essential for survival. These villages were small, often no more than a few dozen families, but their structure was complex, balancing shared responsibilities with individual needs. The village was the heart of peasant society. Houses were clustered close together along a central street or around a green, forming a compact settlement surrounded by open fields. This proximity fostered a sense of collective identity but also meant privacy was minimal. Neighbors knew each other's business, disputes were public, and support networks were vital. Village life revolved around communal obligations. Fields were worked cooperatively. When the harvest came, everyone helped to ensure crops were gathered before bad weather. Tasks like building fences, maintaining roads, or repairing the church were collective efforts. Such cooperation was not optional but enforced by tradition and the lord's authority. The manor court was a local institution where villagers met to settle disputes, enforce rules, and manage communal resources. Here, elected or appointed villagers acted as jurors and officials, administering customary law. This system, though far from democratic, gave peasants some voice in local governance. It regulated everything from land use to livestock management and was crucial for maintaining order. Social hierarchy existed within the village, though less rigid than in the manor at large. Some peasants were wealthier, owning larger plots or more animals, while others were poorer laborers. Elders and heads of families often held informal authority, guiding decisions and resolving conflicts. Yet, everyone depended on each other for survival. Religion deeply shaped village life. The local church was the center not only of worship but of social gatherings. It marked rites of passage, baptisms, marriages, funerals, and festivals that brought the community together. The churchyard might host markets or fairs, turning spiritual occasions into social and economic events. Daily life was punctuated by shared rhythms. Church bells called villagers to prayer and work. The seasons dictated planting and harvest, and festivals broke the monotony with music and dance. Even meals had communal aspects. Some villages held annual feasts or celebrations where food was shared beyond family units. Despite the sense of community, life was not without tension. Resources were limited, and conflicts over land, livestock, or water were common. Accusations of theft, disputes over boundaries, or quarrels between families could escalate, sometimes requiring the intervention of the manor court. Gossip and rivalry were part of the social fabric. Yet, the village remained the source of identity and resilience. In a world dominated by lords and clergy, peasants found strength in numbers. Shared hardship fostered solidarity, and collective memory preserved traditions and values. The village was not merely a place but a living community, sustaining generations through toil, faith, and mutual support. Understanding this communal life reveals that medieval peasants were far from isolated or powerless. They navigated complex social networks, managed resources collectively, and shaped their own destinies within the constraints imposed by the feudal system. Among the many challenges medieval peasants faced, one of the most unpredictable and feared was war. While peasants themselves rarely fought as knights did, they often bore the brunt of conflicts waged by their lords or invading armies. Wars disrupted harvests, destroyed villages, and brought death and misery to rural communities. Feudal lords were obligated to provide knights and soldiers to their monarch in times of war. This meant that peasants might see their men conscripted, leaving fewer hands to work the fields. Sometimes, armies marched through peasant lands, requisitioning food, livestock, and shelter. This foraging could be devastating, stripping villages of the very resources they needed to survive. Raids by bandits or rival factions added to the dangers. Villages without strong defenses were vulnerable to attack, and peasants could be caught in the crossfire or even forced into servitude or slavery. The constant threat of violence cast a long shadow over rural life. Warfare also affected the economy. Taxes to fund armies increased, and lords demanded greater contributions to equip their soldiers. Peasants often found themselves paying more, while receiving less protection. Some lords neglected their duties, allowing their lands to be pillaged with little resistance. On rare occasions, peasants took up arms themselves. Uprisings, though often brutally suppressed, erupted in response to unfair taxes or harsh treatment. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is a famous example, where thousands protested against poll taxes and feudal abuses. Though ultimately crushed, such revolts revealed the simmering tensions beneath the surface of feudal society. Despite the dangers, many peasants sought to avoid conflict altogether. Villages sometimes negotiated truces or paid protection money to avoid being pillaged. Strong village walls or fortified manors provided some defense. But for most, war was a distant but ever-present threat that could arrive without warning. The impact of war on medieval peasants was profound. Beyond the immediate loss of life and property, wars disrupted the delicate balance of feudal obligations, economies, and social structures. Recovery could take years, and the scars, both physical and psychological, lasted generations. Yet, in the face of war's devastation, peasants demonstrated resilience. They rebuilt homes, replanted fields, and maintained their communities. Their lives were a testament to endurance amidst chaos, highlighting the harsh realities of medieval existence. Another defining aspect of medieval peasant life was their relationship with animals. Livestock were far more than just property. They were vital to survival, sources of labor, food, and even social status. The animals a peasant owned could mean the difference between famine and plenty, and caring for them was a daily responsibility that required skill and attention. Most peasants kept a small number of animals suited to their land and means. Cows provided milk, cheese, and butter, essential sources of nutrition, especially when meat was scarce. A cow was a valuable asset, often one of the most prized possessions a family had. Goats were similar but easier to keep on poorer land. Chickens supplied eggs and meat, while pigs were prized for their ability to convert scraps and foraged materials into rich meat and fat. Working animals like oxen and horses were indispensable. Oxen, slow but strong, pulled the heavy wooden plows that broke the soil each spring, and hauled carts loaded with grain or firewood. Horses were faster and more valuable but less common among peasants due to their higher upkeep costs. Sometimes a peasant might share or rent an animal with neighbors to reduce expenses. Keeping animals was not without its challenges. They needed shelter, food, and protection from predators. Many peasants housed their animals inside the cottage during winter to keep them warm and safe, which added to the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Diseases among livestock could spread quickly, and without veterinary knowledge, losses were frequent. Breeding animals was an important skill, ensuring the sustainability of the herd or flock. The birth of a healthy calf or piglet meant hope for the future, while illness or stillbirth was a serious setback. Peasants observed animal behavior closely and developed remedies for common ailments, though many were based on superstition rather than science. Animals also played roles beyond the practical. They were part of village customs and celebrations. Pigs might be slaughtered during festivals or winter to provide food for the months ahead. Dogs were kept for herding or protection, and cats were valued for controlling rodents that threatened grain stores. The relationship between peasants and their animals was intimate. They depended on each other for survival. Caring for livestock was a year-round commitment, and the loss of an animal could plunge a family into crisis. This bond shaped daily routines and the very fabric of rural life. Through this lens, we see that medieval peasants were not merely passive victims of circumstance. They were knowledgeable stewards of their environment, adapting to challenges with resilience and ingenuity. Their animals were partners in a life defined by labor, faith, and community. Education for medieval peasants was limited and largely informal. Unlike the nobility, who often sent their children to schools or tutored them at home, peasant children's learning was rooted in practical skills necessary for survival. Formal schooling was rare, especially in rural areas, and literacy was a luxury few peasants could afford. From an early age, children were taught the tasks expected of them by observing and assisting their parents. Boys learned to handle tools, tend animals, and work the fields, while girls were trained in cooking, spinning, weaving, and household management. These skills were essential for maintaining the family's livelihood and were passed down through generations. Most peasants were illiterate, and the ability to read or write was uncommon. The church was the primary institution promoting literacy, but even then, instruction was generally reserved for clergy or nobility. Some children, particularly boys who showed promise or had connections to local priests, might learn basic reading and writing, mostly in Latin, the language of the church. Oral tradition played a crucial role in education and cultural transmission. Stories, songs, proverbs, and religious teachings were memorized and recited, helping preserve history, morality, and community values. The local priest or monk might deliver sermons that doubled as lessons in faith and conduct. This method of teaching ensured that knowledge spread even without written texts. Peasants also learned through experience. Trial and error shaped understanding of agriculture, weather patterns, and animal husbandry. Folk wisdom, passed down over centuries, offered practical advice, such as when to plant crops or how to predict storms. Although not scientific by modern standards, this knowledge was invaluable. Religious education was especially important. The church taught peasants the basics of Christian belief, including prayers, commandments, and the lives of saints. Participation in Mass, confession, and holy days reinforced this spiritual instruction. The fear of sin and hope for salvation influenced daily behavior and societal norms. Despite their lack of formal education, peasants were not ignorant. Their survival depended on a deep understanding of their environment, social structures, and religious expectations. Their knowledge was practical, embodied in skills and customs that guided every aspect of life. This contrast between peasant and noble education reflects the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe. While lords and clergy controlled written knowledge and political power, peasants maintained their own forms of learning that sustained their communities and ensured continuity through turbulent times. The medieval peasant's diet was simple, repetitive, and heavily dependent on what the land could provide. Unlike the lavish banquets of nobility, peasant meals focused on sustenance and practicality rather than variety or taste. Food was often scarce, and the quality depended largely on the success of the season and the availability of resources. At the center of most meals was pottage, a thick, hearty stew made by boiling grains, vegetables, and occasionally bits of meat or fish. This dish was flexible, incorporating whatever ingredients were on hand: barley, oats, onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, and root vegetables like turnips or carrots. Herbs from the garden or wild sources added flavor, but spices were rare and expensive, typically beyond the reach of peasants. Bread was a staple, though its quality varied. Dark, coarse rye or barley bread was common in northern Europe, while wheat bread was more prevalent in the south. Baking was usually done in a communal oven owned by the lord of the manor, and peasants had to pay to use it. This reliance meant fresh bread was not always available, and stale bread might be softened in broth or ale. Meat was a luxury rather than a daily item. Peasants might raise pigs, chickens, or sheep, but most of these animals were slaughtered only on special occasions or festivals. Hunting wild game was typically forbidden, reserved for the nobility, and poaching could lead to severe punishment. Fish, especially freshwater fish from rivers and ponds, provided another source of protein and was especially important during fasting days when meat was prohibited by the church. Dairy products like milk, cheese, and butter were important nutritional components, particularly in regions where cattle were common. Milk was often turned into cheese or sour milk, which lasted longer and was easier to store. Butter was valuable and sometimes used for trade or payment. Peasants drank water when it was safe, but often consumed ale or small beer, a weak, fermented beverage with low alcohol content that was safer due to boiling during brewing. Ale was consumed daily by men, women, and children alike. It provided calories and hydration and was a staple of the medieval diet. Seasonal variations heavily influenced the diet. Winter was the hardest time, with fresh vegetables scarce and stored grains or root vegetables forming the bulk of food. Spring brought fresh greens and herbs, while summer and autumn provided fruits, nuts, and abundant vegetables. Preservation techniques like salting, smoking, or drying were essential for storing food through harsh months. Fasting, dictated by the church, also shaped eating habits. There were many fasting days throughout the year when meat, dairy, and sometimes fish were forbidden. These fasts demanded alternative meals, often centered on grains, vegetables, and legumes. The peasantry observed these rules strictly, blending religious obedience with the practical realities of scarcity. Malnutrition and hunger were constant threats. Crop failures, poor harvests, or harsh winters could lead to famine, weakening the population and making illness more deadly. Despite these challenges, peasants found ways to adapt, relying on local knowledge and resourcefulness. In this diet, we see the harsh realities and adaptations that defined peasant life. A reliance on the land's bounty, a blend of necessity and faith, and a daily struggle to nourish families through the cycles of nature and the demands of the feudal system. As we reach this part of our journey through the life of a medieval European peasant, it's important to reflect on the quiet strength and resilience that defined their existence. Their days were marked by endless labor, hardship, and uncertainty, yet their lives also contained moments of faith, community, and hope. The world of the peasant was one of simplicity but complexity, a world where survival depended on a delicate balance between human effort, nature's bounty, and the often harsh demands of the social order. They lived under the shadow of powerful lords and the church, yet carved out their own space through cooperation, tradition, and a profound connection to the land. While they rarely made history in the grand sense, no battles won or castles built, their daily struggles laid the foundation for medieval society. Their hands tilled the soil that fed kingdoms, their labor built villages and maintained the manor system, and their faith sustained communities through plague, famine, and war. The peasant's legacy is not found in chronicles or castles, but in the enduring rhythms of rural life, the customs passed down, and the very fabric of European history. Their stories, often overlooked, remind us of the human spirit's capacity to endure even the most daunting challenges. So, as you drift off tonight, think not of grand heroes or kings, but of the countless peasants whose humble lives shaped the world in ways still felt today. Their story is one of survival, resilience, and quiet dignity, the true backbone of medieval Europe. Good night.